Hey guys, welcome to our presentation. We are going to be presenting John Winthrop. My name is Carolina and my classmates are Sifa and Ruby.
So starting off with who John Winthrop was. John Winthrop had all the power for his time. He worked for the proprietors. He was the co-owner of a colony of Massachusetts. He also was the head of the New England Puritan Church, and he was a governor, which allowed him to enforce and create laws. John Winthrop believed that in the traditional European order, where the guiding principles of the people was that every rule must be followed by scripture, and that the root of all sin was selfishness, which is why John Winthrop believed that you should put others before yourself. This belief of selfishness being the root of sin is opposing to what capitalists believe. Capitalism believed that self-interest was considered a virtue. In other words, self-interest was looked at as having high moral standards by capitalists. He also believed that everyone should follow the faith that everyone follows because it was less problematic compared to somewhere where people can preach what they want. Lastly, he believed that inequality was a serious issue, which which is why he says that no one can succeed unless everyone works together, which is what resembles the craftsman workshop in Europe. Craftsmen are people who make everything you couldn't make yourself. For example, clothing. And they're the most important people in the economy. There are 3 levels of craftsmen. The first one is apprentice, then journeyman, and lastly, the master. The first level is apprentice. You start this level at the age of 12 or 13, and you finish it in 5 to 7 years. The second level is the journeyman. You start this level right after you pass the apprentice level. So at age 17 to 20 years old, a journeyman's job is to get out of town for 3 years, learn from a master, then come back and show what you learned. And maybe you'll get permission to become a master. This is also the best way to build innovation. And the last level of the craftsman is to become a master. When you become a master, you get to hire your own employees to work for you and you pay them in return. The master of a house in an original economy was usually the father. He lived with his own family, servants, and employees, which included people like the apprentice. So the master had to become their legal guardians in order for the employees to live and work for him there because they were still young. While working in the household, there was still a major degree of equality. Not only would the employees and servants work, the master would too, which is how the teaching process is done. Occasionally, the master would ask his employees to work alone, but the majority of the time he was working alone with them. When a craftsman offers his goods in the marketplace, the prices he can set are set by custom, and the wages he pays are also set by custom. The standard of fairness in the capitalist marketplace is that both parties have agreed to pay that price, while the standard of fairness in a moral economy is the livelihood that they can make a decent living working at the station, which includes the ability to buy something nice for yourself. Livelihood is the moving target as society becomes richer and more sophisticated. The prices on items were also very high, so the masters were able to pay their employees what they deserved.
Guilds. What are guilds? It's an organization that encompasses everyday who works in a craft. Not all guilds have their crafts to have the same price. The quality has to stay at a high level, and guilds are the ones that set the fair wage. Guilds have the harmony between different level of economic hierarchy. Guilds is based on harmony between the different levels of economic hierarchy as well as masters in charge of journeyman and the apprentices. They start off with employers and management. Some guilds are way better than others. They also have like city government functions by the same principle, the notion that religious, political, and economic all have to come from one source. Guilds elect the best nominates to fit in, like so they have to have like the good qualities in order to be chosen as the spot to become a city councilor or a mayor. From there, they choose by having a lottery to get the spot, and then they reserve their spot depending on how wealthy or important or even powerful that person is. Guilds build their own churches to assert their religious roles and hold Bible studies.
Continuing with the economic aspect, we'll be going back and forth between the traditional order and the capitalist marketplace. In the cities, the economic structure is supposed to be as similar as the farms and manors in the countryside, but the practice is a bit different. While the relationships between members of the guild show mutual respect, the relationship between the lord of the manor and the peasants show less. There is also little to none equality and cooperation between them. Peasants are not necessarily slaves or properties, but are considered bound to the soil. This is where the phrase comes into play, meaning that they belong to the land and the person in charge of the land. One of the things that a lord cannot do, which is significantly different from the marketplace, is sell their land. Reason why is because it is entrusted by the king and it belongs to the king, or further, it belongs to God. Just like the peasants and farmers who cannot leave or do whatever they want, nobles are bound to the soil as well because it is part of their family patrimony.
Kings and lords, there are different levels of power and respect. God for sure is the one that has a higher one than the king. And then from there it goes on to kings and nobles having the same level shown right here. And then from there it goes to noblemen's and journeymen's are part of household of the master and do craft considered to be members of the household of the king.
Adam Smith, who was the father of capitalism, said that people should be allowed to practice and follow their self interest to create more wealth, and by doing that, you are doing good. Others argue that self interest is of the devil and consider it the root of all sins. And some just question at what point of accumulating wealth are you doing good. Another major difference is that people are not obligated to one another. In other words, you are not bound to the soil. You can also leave your job or you can fire the workers who are doing poorly. Although you can leave your position, you put yourself in danger of making a living because you do not have any wages and you're also in need of employment. So, how we got from the traditional order to capitalism is one, the discovery of America created a whole lot of wealth for the merchant class of Europe, which led to investment opportunities that they didn't have in the system. After growing their wealth, merchants often apply the lessons they learned from labor management, relations from the slave plantations, to the relations between the workers and employers in Europe. Another reason is the political revolutions. The revolutions in France and in America removed existing laws from their king and enforced these economic ideals to protect them from overexploitation.
Actions that Winthrop does in transition from traditional order to capitalist society, what he does is what he wants to do is develop a Christian argument against an economy that's based on self-interest. By doing that, he wanted to remove Europe to go to America, starting from the beginning to rebuild society, along with the rules of the moral economy that had governed Europe, but that was being disregarded increasingly on this continent that was not just going through economic change but divided by religious conflict.
In John Winthrop's sermon, he preached three reasons why God created inequality. One is that the variety inherent in disparity accurately reflects the breadth of his creation. Another reason is that since everyone is so different, God can enter their lives in equally different ways, which is further proof of his variety and greatness. Another reason that God has placed people in such different fortunes is so that they might discover a need for one another. He also gives his audience six important practical consideration for a merciful life in society. These have to do with liberality, which is giving money or goods or lending. The first consideration is that people ought to give charitably whenever possible. However, as Winthrop adds in his second consideration, the needs of one's family comes first. Third, Winthrop advises against laying up or stockpiling wealth because such hoarding neglects the present needs of others. Winthrop's fourth consideration is that giving is particularly necessary when the borrower cannot repay the debt, as this signifies great deed. With reference of Christ's golden rule, and Winthrop urges regular forgiveness of debts incurred even through business. Winthrop's last consideration for the merciful life explains why he urges his audience to give so much with more enlargement towards others and less respect for ourselves. He claims no one truly owns that which he possessed, reminding his audience that the ancient primitive church adopted a communistic view of worldly possessions without ownership. In capitalism, the Puritans laid the foundation for the religious, social, and political order when entering their stations or being born into their stations. Guilds were able to build churches and practice their religion as well as joining councils to manage markets in their economic society. In the textbook, the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Chapter 1, Weber begins to explain his premise by describing Catholics as more attached to their traditional crafts, while Protestants tend to become skilled laborers in factories. In addition, Protestants form a greater proportion of factory owners, managers, and business investors. According to Weber, the type of environment in which families raise their youth, religious instruction in the home, and the type of secondary education offered influence their choice of career. Weber then discusses the other differences between Catholic and Protestant attitudes towards life and how these vary across different national borders. He emphasizes that the hard work ethic of Protestantism is probably not connected to the joy of living of the Enlightenment. Weber further complicates the issue by pointing out that even different strands of Protestantism have displayed different emphasis on the promotion of capitalist development, and that this too varies by geographic location. For example, he cites Calvinist areas of Germany like Wuppertal as having slightly stronger capitalist tendencies than Lutheran areas. To clarify the complexity of his notes, Weber will need precise and specific concepts because these provide the necessary foundation for analyzing historical and social complexity. Before introducing these concepts, Weber says that he will need some explanatory remarks on the peculiarities of his subject, the spirit of capitalism. Weber begins by investigating his use of the spirit of capitalism. He states that a definition must be put together from parts located in specific historical circumstances. He quotes Benjamin Franklin about economic thinking, including Franklin's statement that time is money. This quotation is used to support Weber's contention that it amounts to the peculiar ethic, which is more than mere business astuteness. It is the peculiar ethic that Weber means to investigate. He notes that Franklin's moralism is shot through the utilitarianism. In other words, behaviors like honesty and punctuality are desirable as a practical means to an end, financial benefits. After many discussions, Weber suggests that what changed to turn traditional home based subcontractors into capitalistic modes of production was not the advent of new money, but rather a new spirit. It's the spirit that propelled capitalism's rise, not new money. He notes further that the best suited capitalists themselves are not daredevil speculators, but sober and shrewd characters. The ideal capitalist in Weber's eyes avoids bragging about and showing their wealth.
Chapter 3, Luther's Conception of the Calling. Luther can't be claimed for his spirit of capitalism in any sense. The religious circles of great achievement of the Reformation are not friendly to capitalism, and Luther would without a doubt have refused any connection with this point of view. It was impossible for Luther to establish a new or in any way fundamental connection between worldly activity and religious principles. His academics, his acceptance of purity as the one infallible criterion of the church was in itself sufficient to check the development of new points of view in ethical matters. The concept of Luther's callings remains traditionalistic, and it is something in which a man had to accept as a divine ordinance, to which he must adapt to himself. The idea of his calling had been anticipated by the German mystics, and to a certain extent, Lutheranism was a step backwards from them. Compared with the mystics, Luther undermined the psychological foundations of rational ethics because he would suspect the as- ascetic self-discipline of the leading to salvation, and he and his church were forced to keep it more in the background. Without Calvinism, his work would had not been successful. Chapter 4, The Religious Foundations of Worldly Asceticism. The four principal forms of ascetic Protestantism are Calvinism, Pietism, Methodism, and the Baptist sects. So none of these movements were completely separated from each other. Even the distinction from non-ascetic churches of the Reformation was never clear. Calvinism is the faith over which the political and cultural struggles of the 16th and 17th centuries were fought in the most highly developed countries, the Netherlands, England, and France. It was imitated by many other movements and used as a source of inspiration in the development of their divergent principles. Pietism is the starting point of the ascetic movement, which remained within the Reformed Church. It first split off the Calvinistic movement in England, mostly in Holland. At the end of the 17th century, it was absorbed into Lutheranism. Compared to Calvinism, the rationalization of life was less intense because of the pressure of occupation with a state of grace, which had continually to be proved.
Chapter 4, continuing on Methodism. Methodism is a combination of an emotional but still ascetic type of religion with increasing indifference or repudiation of the dogmatic basis of Calvinistic aestheticism, characteristic also of the Anglo American movement, corresponding to continual pietism. Its strongest characteristics was its mytho- mythical, systematic nature of conduct. Methodism was usually primarily to bring about the emotional act of conversion, as well used to for the religion had a strong emotional character. As a late product, Methodism can be neglected since it doesn't add any new idea of a calling. The Baptist set is Baptist, Mennonites, and Quakers. Form an independent source of ascetic Protestantism Protestantism other than Calvinism. They influence on the development quite clear in a somewhat different connection. The believers' church, um, the believers' church is what sets the baptizing sets apart. Um, to the saved and the unsaved were a part of the church community. They worked through individual revelation, and one had to wait for the Spirit and avoid sinful attachments to the world. In a way, they were like the Calvinists due to believing and continuing relevance of revelation. So, one thing that they would go based off is honesty is the best policy. Chapter 5, Weber concludes with his study and attempts to understand the relationship between ascetic Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism. It can treat Protestantism as a single whole. Writing the Richard Baxter is a good model of its ethics. Um, in his work, it is striking to see his suspicion of wealth as a dangerous temptation. And then the moral objectification or the moral objection is for reflection, which promotes God's glory, idleness, and that distraction from the pursuit of a righteous life. Weber attempts to clarify the ways in which the Puritan idea of calling and asceticism influenced the development of which capitalistic way of life. Asceticism helped build the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. Thank you for watching.